say hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here with Alex from Infor and Josh and Frank from Guide Technologies. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to talk about some CMMC regulations, and hopefully you guys have some questions and we can answer those at the end. And we're just going to let Alex take over. He has a lot to share with everybody today. Go ahead,
Thanks so
Alex.
much, Sharon. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here with you guys. Thanks very much to Guide for hosting this, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So as Sharon mentioned, we'll start with some slides here to give some basic background information so we can level set with everybody in terms of what's going on, and then we'll follow up with some questions and discussions. So let me get started with the deck here because we would not live without PowerPoint. All right. Sorry, just give me there we are. All right. And folks, just let me know when you can see the screen.
Do it.
Yep, we can see your screen.
Excellent. Okay, thanks so much. So this is our CMMC update for November 2025. Right, so let's talk about this a little bit. So what is CMMC and what does it stand for? So this is the Cybersecurity Maturation Model Certification. Naturally, only the Department of Defense could come up with an acronym like this. But it's basically DoD's framework for cybersecurity to safeguard controlled unclassified information. And a subset of that would be federal contracting information. So it's within the defense industrial base. And basically this was initiated about 7 years ago or so as a concept. Formally became a program in the last couple of years, but it didn't really have any teeth in terms of an enforcement mechanism, right? So when that went into effect, right, so 2.0 was released in 2021, if we look under the overview, right, the first bullet that's there. So it streamlines compliance in accordance with the NIST standard, right? So that's the 800-171. So there's different levels of cybersecurity requirement compliance here that come with that, levels 1, 2, and 3, which you'll see there. And then the question became, who is it going to apply to, and is the federal government actually going to institute this and make it mandatory across the board? And so there were a lot of discussions across the community. Is it going to happen? The Pentagon had signaled it was headed that direction from the CIO's office, and then it really became a matter of policy from the senior levels of government and the administrations, both the previous and current administration, to determine if that was going to happen. So we were all expecting it to take place at the end of Q1 this year. There were a couple of incidents over the last year. The Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of War, it stated that there were some issues with foreign actors trying to get access to clouds for maintenance purposes. And at that point, that followed years of corporate proprietary data theft, where we've had near-peer adversaries overseas, in Asia and in a few other places, who had been attempting to steal defense industrial base secrets to gain a competitive advantage, over the United States. Particularly if we were to enter into a near-peer adversary conflict. So what that means, sort of in plain English, we spent the last 25 years engaged in a global war on terrorism, in which we were fighting unsophisticated actors in terms of the armaments and weapon systems that they used. And now, for the last 15 years or so, the last 4 administrations between Trump, Biden, and Obama have all said the same thing. It's not a partisan matter, that there's going to be a pivot to the Pacific or a shift towards Asia as a focus. And so as a result of that, if there were to be some sort of conflict down the road, and hopefully not for that matter, but if it were to come to that, it would be a near-peer adversarial conflict, right? So we wouldn't be fighting unsophisticated actors in terms of equipment. These would be folks with advanced latest generation fighter jets, missiles, missile defense systems, et cetera. And so, we were finding the defense industrial base was a prime target for foreign intelligence services to try to steal those secrets. And as a result of that, the Department of Defense finally said, look, I know the administration doesn't want to put new regulations on business and the community in general, but this is absolutely required to safeguard the nation's secrets and make sure that we are not going to be falling behind, potential adversaries, and that we can, defend and hopefully deter any future conflict from occurring. And so that was sort of the impetus or the reason why this came about the way that it is. And so in order to protect, the department came up with a framework that is CMMC. And so what you see in front of you, level 1, level 2, and level 3, vast majority of companies will fall into the level 2 category. Altogether, Forbes published an article a couple of months ago that there were about 300,000 companies total in the defense industrial base, some small ones providing, just services, not necessarily manufacturing. But of those, they're expecting about 80,000 will require level 2 certification. And of that, only about 275 at the time were certified at the end of August, mainly the large prime contractors. but that number has grown a little bit since then. And part of this, which we'll discuss going forward, is that this applies to subcontractors and suppliers as well, and they're expecting prime contract holders to make sure that they're validating and vetting their supply chains to ensure compliance. And that's not the government's responsibility. They're looking at that as the contract holder. So if you are awarded a contract and there's a CMMC clause from the Defense Supplement, Federal Acquisition Reg, you'll see the DFAR coming up. That will be your cue that you will be required to do that and make sure that you are, qualifying your base, or if you happen to be a tier 2 or tier 3 supplier or a subcontractor to a prime or an integrator. Okay. So what that means here, right? So there's about 110 controls for level 2, which will hit going forward that need to be applied. And then there's a greater if you get to level 3, and then there's a timeline associated with that, which we're going to cover coming up. So that final rule that I talked about, because like I said, there's been no teeth to date in terms of enforcement mechanism. That changed on September 10th. So on September 10th, the federal government published the rule change in the Federal Registrar, which embeds CMMC directly into the acquisition process, and it goes into effect 60 days after publication, which was in fact 2 days ago on November 10th. So at that time, all new solicitations moving forward should have a clause or several clauses in the contract, or the solicitation rather, stipulating that if there is control unclassified information or the potential to store it, if you look at the regs, right, or federal contracting information, the subset there, and there's specific language around what that applies. We'll look at some of the definitions in a minute. Then you will be required to have meet CMMC certification in order to be awarded the contract. One of the DFAR clauses that's coming into effect literally will instruct the contracting officer on the government side that you cannot be awarded the contract if you are not compliant. And so that's the significant change that took place as of 2 days ago. So where you've had previously, the framework to protect, control, and classified information, there really wasn't an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement now is that you would not be able to be awarded the contract or be re-awarded, an option year on a contract that calls for it if you're not compliant. So that overall is a little bit of the history and what's changed over the last few days, which has been 7 years in the making for the community. Okay, so I'm gonna move to the next slide here. So what does it mean for contractors, right? So 7021 is activated, right, which we talked about. So competing for new awards, exercising option years, and receiving modifications or extensions, okay, if you require it. So that comes up a lot from folks, does this every contract, does it apply to me, does it not? So it is specific, right, for the regulations as to whether or not you've got that handle federal contracting information or controlled unclassified information for which there are definitions that contracting officers will be holding folks accountable to. And that's something that your compliance folks will become familiar with if they're not already, okay, and what that means and how it affects the business. Okay. So we talked about some of those changes coming, right? So here's some of the cybersecurity compliance, and we've gotten some support from colleagues at BDO, Christina Reynolds, who is a world-renowned expert in this field, to help provide some of the information here. But if we take a look at the DFAR clauses here, they're highlighted in yellow on the right, 7021, right? Cybersecurity maturation model, right? Requirements and rulemaking in 48 CFR. And then also the DFAR 7025, right? So notice of the model requirements. So that's the one that's instructing that it needs to be there. So those are new and have been added. So oftentimes things are confused as well, right? So people say, CMMC, ITAR, EAR, they're sort of used interchangeably. They're actually very different things. So EAR, right, is your export administration regulations, right, for dual use items, and that's regulated by the U.S. Department of Commerce and overseen by it for enforcement, right? And then there's the International Traffic and Arms Control regulations, and that's for defense articles, right, and services, export and import of those. That's covered by the DDTC at the State Department. It's the Directorate for Trade Control on the defense side. And then CMMC is the Department of Defense, and it's being instituted through DFAR clauses, right, which is as we mentioned, the defense supplement to the Federal Acquisition Regs. So what all that acronym soup means in plain English is there are two sets of export control regulations, EAR and ITAR, which are regulated by Commerce and State. Separately from that, you've got CMMC, which are cybersecurity models. So in that particular case, there are some companies that if they have business or an entity of their company that happens to be in Canada or what we call one of the English-speaking five, sometimes they'll get a TA waiver from the State Department that will allow them to have foreign national access for the purposes of arms control. That doesn't extend naturally to CMMC in terms of foreign nationals accessing things. So that's where we talk about this in terms of a partnership being a shared responsibility model. Our offerings, our CMMC ready offerings are hosted on Amazon Web Services, CMMC compliant GovCloud. The product itself is CMMC ready, but then it requires the end user, whoever, whichever company is purchasing and using the system to ensure that they're only allowing folks access to the system who are authorized to have it, and that the controls are in place and the configuration when you go through the setup of the system to meet the compliance. So you can get a CMMC ready cloud and a CMMC ready product, but then it's incumbent upon the users to maintain the access. That way you meet the requirements. And then we'll talk about that coming in a couple of slides here in terms of what you'll need to do for compliance purposes, both for self-certification to start and then to have a third party come in and do that in the years to follow. Okay. So just want to make sure everybody's clear because those often get interchanged. Okay. So again, we talked about the effective date, right? So it's November 10th of 2025. So notifies the contractors they're required to have level 2 cert, right? Functions basically as the enforcement mechanism to make sure that there's teeth behind it, because right now, prior to that, they could not award. Okay. And it's basically a notice of the requirement. So that's why it's for solicitations going forward. It's letting you know if you're bidding on this, you won't be able to win it if you're not certified. Okay. And it works together previously with clauses that were already out there. On the right, you'll see 7012, right? That's safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. And then 7020 run right now with the assessing contractor implementation of cybersecurity requirements. So it's building on, hey, the program exists to now not only it exists, but you also have to ensure that you meet compliance if you want to be eligible to win new business. Okay. So in terms of the history of what this is, right? So 7012, if you look there on the left on the bottom, right? That's published on November 18th of 2013, active as of 2017, right? And then part 32 there, right? That's CMMC itself as a program, published on October of 2024 and activated again, a couple months later on December 16th, right? And then what we have is now the 7021 and 7025, which are the teeth about not being able to be awarded, published again on September 10th, and now active as of November 10th. So as you can see, this goes back conceptually all the way till 2013. So it's actually 12 years going back, chasing back to 7012. Okay. So in terms of a timeline, and we'll hit a couple of these slides. What does this mean? So for phase 1 self-assessment, so if you are level 1 and level 2, based on your level of potential access to CUI that's in the contracts, et cetera, or you have a system that's capable of storing, right? You basically have 12 months to do a self-certification in a government portal where you're going to have to go in and certify that all 110 controls have been reviewed. And then you're going to have to score against it. If you have a single -3 or -5, you will end up failing. It will not allow you to continue. It'll gray out, right? And that comes under penalty of perjury in terms of the certification, because if there's a problem later on, they'll go back and say, hey, who signed off on this in the company? Did they actually implement the controls? So that's from the first year, right, which is basically from 2 days ago till a year from now. And then in the second year, which is phase 2, right, that's when you're going to require a third-party firm to come in and do a certification for you from the outside, right? And then they may start including level 3 certs in the documents as necessary. And then level 3, which is a higher level of certification, right, will be then months 24 through 36. So all in, all companies, if they require level 1, level 2, or level 3, over the next 36 months should be rolled out. Okay. So where are we in terms of this overall timeline we've talked about here? Again, thanks to friends at BDO for helping to put some of this together. You'll see the November date right there. We are here, right? We're now at November 12th, so right about the timeline it was launched. And that gives you the phase. So the C3PAO assessments, right? That's basically going to take a long time to roll that out. That begins at the beginning of the second year. So that's where you got the star there where it says end of self-assessment. So from now through next November, you're able to self-assess, go in the system and tell them that you're ready. But then a year from now, you're going to need to have a firm who's going to come in and do that if this applies to you. Okay.
So Alex, a quick question for you. This is a pretty hot button topic, but Cyber AB just came out and said that there's about 567 C3PAOs that are certified, ready to do an audit. Do you see that as a bottleneck for 80,000 customers to be certified the next 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, I do see it as a potential bottleneck. I mean, just numerically, as you mentioned there, right? And there is the ability for more folks to come online, but they've got to go through training to do that. So the self-assessment period, I don't think is going to change in terms of the initial, right? But if you just do the sheer math there's a potential that self-assessment period may be extended in the event that there aren't enough, C3PAO firms with slots for availability to get that done, or will the government accept the fact that you then got a future date already scheduled to get this accomplished? That's kind of unknown, right? So I think that to your point, there is a potential for a strategic choke point. And that's why, we're recommending to folks after speaking to our, compliance experts in the industry as well, to start looking into getting those scheduled, even if you're just getting started now, because they're already starting to book up for 26 and 27 in many cases. So if you can at least get on the radar screen now, let them know you're going to need to do the assessment because you're going to be doing the self-assessment and getting yourself ready over the coming year, then you'll be in a position to take advantage of that. But the folks that'll wait are going to, they're going to have an issue down the road if the government doesn't extend the timeline on that, and if there's an insufficient number of firms who are doing that. Because, to your point, I've spoken about this in the past. There are firms who are doing one of two things, right? So they're either doing the consulting piece up front to help customers, meet the compliance, tell them what they need to do, help them through that process to get there, right? Identify the shortcomings, weaknesses, potential solutions, of which, from the ERP side overall, that we're here to provide to customers, right? In terms of having several offerings to take you from SMB to mid-sized to enterprise companies. As just part of the overall environment and what you need to do. And then those firms will not be then involved in doing the audits on the back end because they're supposed to be independent. So there's two different sets of companies out there helping on both ends, preparatory and then on the back end for review for certification. Perfect. Okay. Right. So when we talk about this, right, so the certificate requirement, right, must have a current cert at the level required by the contract and must maintain that for life. Current means not older than 3 years. Subcontractor flowdowns, right? So all subcontracts, except for COTS. So COTS is an acronym. It stands for commercial off the shelf, right? So if it's something you can buy like Radio Shack or somewhere else, right, that's not going to apply. But if you're manufacturing, that's a different story, right? So prior to subcontracting, the prime's got to ensure, like I was mentioning earlier, that the subcontractors have a current cert at the right level if the contract calls for it. And so we're already starting to see a lot of the massive primes who've had 20, 30-year relationships with suppliers because they plan a year out are already starting to have those conversations, right? And saying, hey, are you ready? Do you plan to get ready based on the percentage of business? Are you going to do this? And so, we'll see what happens as the community starts to react to it as they are. And then we mentioned, right, affirmation of continuous compliance, right? So annually, you got to go into the system and do SPRS, right? And make sure that you're filling out the appropriate forms or inputs, right, to make sure you're meeting cert. And then identification and verification status, right? So if you got a unique identifier, so we make sure we're going and dealing with that, right? And if an offer lacks current status in the system, they are not eligible for an award. So the government's going to be checking. So contracting officers are required to check the supplier performance risk system, right? The SPRS, to confirm that you have current status, or else they're not going to be able to award the contract. So it's not going to be a wave of the pen. There's some discussions now. What about contracts that have already been issued, and what do we do about, option years on those contracts? The language offers some discretion to the contracting officer for that. It is absolutely certain from November 10th forward, right, that that's what's supposed to be going into the solicitations where it's required. And then, depending on the sensitivity of the contracts, if you have previous statements about, being required to meet CMMC without the teeth in there, right, then that's something that come back and they could take a look at. So there's still a little bit of gray space there in terms of the interpretation, but that'll be up to the contracting officers to follow the regulations and guide to the best of their ability. And that's just something we as a community need to be aware of as we're looking at the documentation. Where do we stand? What are the requirements? Is my company subject to this? If it is, at what level? And then ensuring that you've got a pathway to compliance. Which again, the easiest way to do it is if you're already due looking for an upgrade, and folks are kind of trying to figure out what to do there. We've got Guy who's got an amazing team with, well-versed in the industry to be able to talk to you about the functional requirements, system configurations, industry-specific requirements for compliance purposes. And then we've got a system that's obviously compliant in terms of it being CMMC ready, hosted on a CMMC cloud. And we have letters of attestation as well, because we have to do the same reviews, basically saying, hey, we had our annual review and we meet cert. And that's something we'd be able to provide copies of. So then when it's your turn to have your auditors come in, it makes life easy and clean for you from that perspective. Okay. Okay. So again, so we talked about this. These are the main players of things we're looking for, right, coming in. So 7012, so safeguarding, the defense information and cyber incident reporting. So that's 800, that's NIST 800's 171 required controls, right? The same thing, right? Then there's DoD assessment requirements, which is established in 7020. And then in 7021, right, that's going to require the subs as we just mentioned before. So just hitting that home to make sure everybody's understanding the DFAR clauses as they start showing up in contracts. Okay. So what does it mean? Like I just talked about this here, right? So as we're looking at this, as we're looking at the different options that are available, right? I'd look to give you a sense of what the numbers are according to some of the open source documentation that's available, right? And again, you're gonna have to certify you're compliant to be eligible. And if you look at that, the question then becomes, well, what if I just try to meet, security standards with the current on-prem offering that I have right now? I mean, most folks are on, if you're on an older on-prem version of software, right? First of all, although the major OEMs on the software side are moving towards a cloud model going forward and off of on-prem because that's the future of where the software is going. And for economies of scale, it just makes sense. And that's where all the latest and greatest features and functions are being invested in on the cloud side. So if you look at it and you're trying to do a TCO analysis, is it better to spend the money to try to secure on-prem what I have now? When you look at the balance of it, it'll tip in the favor of cloud from the numbers perspective anyway. And then that's also not getting any of the new features or functions that would be required or that you would get with moving with an upgraded system. So you'd automatically be in a position to be compliant. So you get all the new features or functions. And really, the other benefit too is if you choose to try to do that on-prem yourself, you are responsible for all of the security architecture and then all of the hardware that comes with it and everything else, and the cost of implementation of any of the safeguards that go in there. And then you're responsible for the risk that comes with that, as opposed to that shared model where if you're moving to the cloud, Amazon picks up the risk for ensuring that it meets the security requirements there and then Infor on the product side. Okay. So that's the end of the presentation here for a second. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I think we can move sort of into discussion if there's some follow-up questions. Sharon, I don't know if there's the ability for them to enter questions in the chat, but happy to answer to the extent we can and then get back to you with follow-ups if you guys have anything.
Alex, I got a couple more current event
Sure,
questions for you. But so Secretary Hegseth came out with a new procurement process in the Secretary of War. Do you see that affecting CMMC in any way, changing the way that they're purchasing defense?
Excellent question. So, I mean, they're kind of they're not quite mutually exclusive, but they're in the sense that one won't impact the other. They kind of work together in harmony. So, let me give for the big acquisitions where you need a 4 to 5 year CAPE study, which is overseen by a civilian with a 4-star rank equivalency at the Pentagon to do big strategic studies for acquisition of systems. Most of that stuff exceeds the timeline that our adversaries have, right? It's now public open source information. Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027, right? This is one contingency we're looking at across the world. Doesn't mean it's going to happen that year, but that's when the threat window opens for a possibility of a contingency in the South China Sea. The department has made clear that one of the things they're looking at doing is the mass acquisition of drones, air, sea, and land, particularly to slow down in advance of ships. And again, this one contingency we're discussing, but just it's illustrative of the other contingency we've got globally, which I'll kind of touch on overall. There's a 100-mile strait between the Chinese coast and Taiwan, so slow Chinese ships as they approach the islands to be able to flex forces from the west and the Pacific in the event that a commander-in-chief makes a decision on a policy level that they want to come in and militarily defend Taiwan. There's no treaty obligation to do so, but our posture on that has been rather ambiguous, I think, specifically as a means of deterrent. But in that case, right, that means mass acquisition of drones in a very short period of time and some other, key weapon systems to keep us at a strategic advantage compared to adversaries. And so the old acquisition cycles are cumbersome in that sense. And in some cases, like I just mentioned, they may eclipse the adversary's timeline. And as we like to remind folks, unfortunately, from 9/11, right, the adversary gets a say in timing. Right. And, I'm glad that we've got a 4 to 5 year acquisition cycle, to make sure we get the CAPE study in. But if your adversary is looking at a 1 to 2 year window for potential action, it's well within inside your acquisition cycle. And so, this is the previous administration had begun looking at it. This administration is looking at it. The Pentagon is one of the largest bureaucracies in the entire world. I worked in the building, so it's not an outside criticism. I was part of that one small cog in a giant wheel. And I think there's an attempt to see what they can do to streamline that. So at the same time, while we're doing that, cyber threat actors are becoming much more sophisticated in attempting to penetrate the defense industrial base. And I can't get into too much detail, but while I was still in government, sitting at the Pentagon, I was chief of sensitive activities specifically for special operations and combating terrorism, but I had special technical operations and some other acquisition stuff. And I remember sitting across the desk, brought an NCIS agent with me from a defense CEO, and had to explain that their system was not going to be given a contract because their weapon system was already built on a test range overseas for which there were photographs, and they hadn't even finished the acquisition process in the US. And it was because their system had been exposed and the adversary got their hands on the designs and it already got out in front of them, and then we're building countermeasures. Right. So that makes that, multi-billion-dollar weapon system rendered useless before it even gets fielded. And so that's the type of stuff they're trying to protect against. And that's the reason that we're looking at. So if you look at just the threat picture going forward, and overall from a market standpoint, right? So we have Europe, which accounts for NATO overall, but in Europe particularly, 15% of foreign military sales, or FMS, go to Europe right now. Europe is increasing spending across NATO, for that matter, from 2 to 5%, right across the board with incremental increases. So we're looking at, over doubling, what what is being spent in Europe on defense, which is going to be more procurement in the United States. We have to restock NATO and allies to pre-war levels from Ukraine because there were a lot of defense articles that were transferred and new stuff is being purchased. So not only are we transferring, we're trying to equip a million-man army in Ukraine, uh, replacing everything that they're expending in the current fight, and then articles that are being transferred to the Ukrainians from the Europeans, they're then buying new stuff, and that's got to be restocked. We've got an active conflict that was going on in Israel for quite some time where we were expending critical weapon systems like 155 artillery shells, which were also being used in Ukraine. So there's a whole bunch of those weapon systems and money that's being spent that needs to be restocked in scale. And that's just stocking up. Never mind the fact that we've seen obviously Russian actions in Ukraine and potential for future across the board, which European leaders are warning of, regardless of which political party you're in. These are just statements across the board in terms of what we're seeing. So this is not a political discussion. This is just literally an observation, battlefield observation of what we're seeing. We've got nearly 25% of the U.S. Navy is about to be stocked off the coast of Venezuela by the end of the week. And not sure what contingency is going to take place there. So between Europe, between the Pacific, the Middle East is not still quite settled. Looking forward to eventually getting out of there. Every administration has been, but every time that happens, we pivot to the Pacific. We dealt with ISIS in 2014 and 2015 that refocused attention there. There was another attempt to pivot, and then Hamas attacked on 10/7, and the weapon systems were tied up with the Israelis. So for the last 15 years, we've been signaling to near-peer adversaries that we're moving, but we keep getting sucked into the Middle East in those conflicts where a lot of those critical weapon systems we would need in those particular areas are being used. And that's just the defense side, right? And then there are companies on the aerospace side who are component providers, either commercial or as well as defense aviation. And in their cases, we're looking at 2.8% airline growth, in terms of fleet replacement. But because of supply chain delays and back orders, and some of that stuff is not going to be delivered until 2030 or 2040. So a lot of those tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers who are providing parts for MRO on the aviation side are going to see an increase in their orders as well because they're going to be maintaining aging fleets going into 2030 and 2040, right? And if you've got a mixed business that's split between commercial and defense, and if those defense contracts require it, right, then that becomes a question of your business. Do you end up on GovCloud, split between GovCloud and commercial, some combination thereof? Those are all things to consider as the regulatory requirements are being flowed down. And so those are things that us collectively, right, as a team in the ecosystem here, especially with Guide as a premier partner, are things that we can talk to you about and help you kind of work through that as you work for a system selection. Does that make sense, Josh, to answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a huge opportunity in the defense industrial based supply chain, right? Reshoring, bringing that manufacturing back to the US.
Absolutely.
So absolutely. And
I think you
then,
actually just raised a good point, if you don't mind, if we'll just hit on it, because,
yeah,
in terms of
absolutely.
re-onshoring, so that's a big thing that folks has too. Like, what about tariffs? As a company, we don't have a position on tariffs. Like, they are, right? They exist. They are what they are. And to your point, the intention from the administration in instituting them is to re-onshore both manufacturing and supply chains to shore up, manufacturing in the U.S. across the board, not just necessarily in defense, but also from a national security perspective and bringing some of that stuff back in. So that is the other factor that's impacting the shift in supply chains. And so separate from CMMC, just the additional functionality you get incrementally with upgrading to latest systems helps you manage the impact of the tariffs from shifting supply chains as well as any tax implications, those types of things that come with it, and then the fact that you need to be flexible because we've seen these policies are changing on a rapid basis. So whether you've got an opinion, good or bad, is irrelevant because they're here. The president's made clear as to what the intention is, and so the system is there to help you guys navigate through those changes. Thanks, Josh. Sorry about that. I think you queued up a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a study just done just in the last couple weeks from a firm called Cybersheath that
Mhm.
said that there was already 89% of the respondents of that defense contractors had already experienced some type of loss from a
Oh yeah.
cyber incident. Is that something you're seeing in the
Yes.
mid-market defense industrial base? Just the
Yeah.
sheer volume of attacks?
Across the board. I mean, folks are seeing it everything from ransomware to, corporate proprietary data theft in terms of espionage from foreign intelligence services that are hostile. I mean, it's a prime target. There's money to be made in defense, from folks who want to do it from an economic secret standpoint. There are countries who want to get their hands on it to gain a competitive advantage in the event of conflict. Whatever your view is on politics or the global balance of power, the US is still the 800-pound gorilla in the room for right now. And there are folks who would like to eat away at that. And to the extent that they can do that through a competitive advantage by stealing, secrets, that's what intelligence services do across the board, right? Everybody's all upset about it. I can't believe it's happening. Everybody has intelligence services. Their job is to provide information to policymakers to give them an advantage, in discussions to advance their particular nation's interests. That also applies to defense and trade secrets. And so, to the extent that they can get their hands on that information, that's quite literally their job. And so, our job collectively as a community, is in response, is to protect the safeguards and safeguard the nation's secrets as it relates to, in this case, control unclassified. It's not classified information, but there is sensitive information that's in there. I mean, thresholds on weapon systems and melting points and all those types of things, while they may seem minor in work instructions that are floating around on your floor in your factory somewhere, right? If you know what the melting point is, then perhaps as you're designing a defeat mechanism of some kind to take down that airframe or that particular platform or whatever it happens to be, that information is helpful. And so the department is saying, hey, to the industrial base, we know you guys are outside of government, but if you're going to do business with us, we're asking you to safeguard those secrets, and these are the controls we're asking you to put in place to help make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's very important. That same study found that of the respondents, only 1% of the defense contractors felt that they were fully prepared for the CMMC audit. So
It's about right.
there's a lot of pent-up demand there for sure.
I mean, you're 100% right. And if you look at that and those statistics coming back, it's because there wasn't a lot of clarity, right? Like, what does it mean?
Right.
How are we going to implement it? What's that going to happen? And, you hear new Pentagon acronyms coming out, or, hey, only 10% of them or 20% of my business is defense, 80% is commercial. This is not, it's a significant part of my revenue, but it's not the mainstay. If I'm a, smaller supplier, I may not have a compliance person on staff or, an in-house attorney. So what does all that mean, right? So we're here collectively to help you through that process. So if you're on here listening and if you happen to fall into that category, right? If you reach out to Guide, reach out to me as well, however wherever your point of contact is, we will collectively ensure that you guys get the information you need and resources that you need to help you make informed decisions as you guys are trying to become compliant.
Yeah, awesome.
Actually, I have a question. Alex,
Sure.
you kind of touched on this a little bit, but there's no exemption for somebody, whether you have average contracts for 50 million or 500 billion, that everyone has to do this, whether you're a small SMB or a large enterprise. Everyone has to follow these regulations, correct?
Yeah, everybody has to follow if they're subject to that vehicle. To factor the cost of compliance and the revenue on the backside, like you said, as you're making those decisions about your business, and if you want to maintain and be in the industry, you have to. And so we're trying to have some discussions just in general with government folks because this is an unfunded government mandate, for lack of a better term, right? There isn't an ability to backbill this right now. So the government's saying if you want to play in the defense space and the business and the contract solicitation calls for CMMC compliant, you're either compliant or you're not. So the impact to SMB in that sense, particularly the small and mid-sized companies, right, is not lost on any of us in the ecosystem. So that's what we're encouraging folks if they speak to their legislators or others, they're engaging government officials. If you have those, ability to do that, if your company engages in that type of effort, those are things that we're trying to raise to officials for that reason. And so I've had several discussions with members of Congress about that as well. And so we'll see where that goes over the next year. But the concern and the question you raised, Sharon, is one many folks across the industry have. So that's why we're asking folks, if you're looking at solicitations, make sure you're looking closely, check the clauses, see what's coming, because if they're issued after November 10th and it's in there, right, and you're bidding on work that's going to be awarded this year and you're not compliant, and they go in the system and see that you're not compliant, the contracting officer quite literally will not be able to give you that contract. That you won't be eligible for the award, even if you're the best price, everything else. So if you've gone through, you've Six Sigma the what out of your business, and you guys are ready to go with the best price, best quality product, and you're able to meet demand, but you're not certified, you're not going to get it. And so that's what we're trying to prevent folks from doing. If your business's plan for scaling and growth relies on the defense contracts that you guys are either currently holding or you're going after, right? We want to make sure that you're in a position to succeed as part of a partnership, right? So you've got experts and folks who implement systems, who understand the industry, who really have the consulting piece of this down, who can help you achieve that in Guide. We're ready to give you the software platform to make that happen, hosted by AWS. So that that trifecta there, right, between Guide, between Amazon Web Services, and between Infor from a product standpoint, collectively will help get you to where you need to be for compliance. And then there's the shared responsibility model back to you as a customer to ensure you meet that for access controls and things of that nature. Sorry, Sharon, I know it was very long-winded, but did that answer the question?
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. And I don't, do we have any questions in the?
There's, let's see.
So yeah, great question. Question about FedRAMP and the FedRAMP marketplace.
Yeah.
How does that coexist with CMMC? What does that mean to be on the FedRAMP marketplace?
Excellent. So FedRAMP and CMMC are sometimes used interchangeably, right? So you get high versus moderate. So looking at that also corresponds back to the level that's required, right, in the system. So excuse me, in the contract and where you fall on. So that forget just the regulation, what it ties to, that then quite literally ties back to some functional issues, right? Are you directly tied to government systems? What level of information are you getting direct access to? And so that then speaks to what level of CMMC compliance you have, and then FedRAMP authorized, right, at what level, at moderate or high, as you're looking at those. So there's a direct tie back to the others, causality wise, in terms of what level you sort of end up residing at in the long run. So the terms are used interchangeably, which I think is why it's a great question. When most of our customers we're looking at are on the moderate side, right, in terms of where they happen to fall for compliance purposes. But if there are folks who are high, that's a different conversation in terms of the enhanced security to be required for those environments. So if you're unsure of where you fall in that, right, that's a question for the compliance person. If you don't have one and you want a consultation to say, hey, can you kind of help me work through that? Absolutely reach back out through Guide, and that's something that we can kind of help you collectively take a look at and determine where you fall. And then, again, that really will tie back to your contracts and your future growth. What areas you're trying to get into. There are folks, if you're looking at providing, perhaps pairs of combat boots somewhere, right? You may not necessarily be falling into a sensitive category. If you're building or constructing or contributing to very sensitive weapon systems or platforms going forward, the chances of you falling into one of the higher categories are much greater, right? And that's just the common sense factor applied. So great question.
Great. If anybody else has additional questions, feel free to throw them in the chat button here. We can try to get to them. And we're more than happy to set up a call after this as well and address some questions one-on-one. If we can, we'll reach out after the show here and
certainly
reach out. But Sharon, any
Chat, no one has any other questions? We can give everybody back a little bit of time in their day.
Yeah, and this is the first of a 4-part series. So look for additional information coming out about a follow-up session that we're going to be doing in January. But yeah, we'll be touching on a couple of different topics. Hopefully we'll have some customers joining us as well to talk about their journey. But this is a very important discussion, very important topic. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Your expertise is amazing. We appreciate your time and, in between flights and traveling the world to join us for a couple minutes here today. We really appreciate you.
Anytime. Happy to be here. Thanks for you guys for doing this. It's important as overall we operate as part of an ecosystem, right? So Infor as itself is an institution, in terms of being a software company and our own services we provide. There are firms who will really specialize in particular industries and particular, software platforms. And so we're really happy to have Guide as a partner to work through this, especially in this period of growth that you guys are experiencing in the industry and the new, regulatory requirements. We're all reacting to it the same way because, it impacts all of us the same. So again, thank you guys for doing this. It's incredibly important, and really appreciate Guide for all your efforts here.
Very good. Thank you. We appreciate everybody's time.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.